Hi, we jump from the end of 1 Samuel 27 over chapter 28 into chapter 29 today to continue David amongst the Philistines. Because as I was trying to show in the introductory video, and I've been mentioning along the way, these last chapters of 1 Samuel from 27 to 31 are not reported in the chronological order for a particular reason, to be able to contrast what David is doing with what Saul is doing, and also to have David narratively far away from the scene where Saul dies. So we can see that location sequence right here as we continue right where we are here, the Philistines at Aphek and the Israelites at Jezreel, and then later at the end of this chapter the Philistines go to Jezreel while David and his men go to Ziklag. And while that's happening, the Philistines will go up to Shunem, and then the Israelites will go to Gilboa, and Saul will have his experience in Endor, and the Philistines will fight with him on Mount Gilboa. If we look at the map, we can see how that makes sense, because here's Aphek. So if the Israelites are in Jezreel and the Philistines went to Aphek and then went to Shunem and then came down to Jezreel, why all this back and forth? Whereas what we're really seeing is that they're just going in this line while David is going back here, and the Israelites are going this way and then retreating up to Endor for Saul's experience with the woman and then over here. So while the Philistines and the Israelites are up here, David will be down here, other than in this immediate scene where he's apparently in Gath along with the commanders and the lords of the Philistines along with Aphek. Although that's where he was before he came up with them to Aphek here. So our scene here starts with Aphek. David had been with the king in Gath. So David comes this far, but when they kick him out, he goes back to Ziklag, as the commanders tell him to do, and then he will stay down there. So that's the sequence of why we're in chapter 29 here. As I've been noting, these three chapters, 27 to 29, form a little sandwich, much like chapter 24, 25, and 26, with Achish both parallel to Saul in the sense of a king that David's in confrontation with, but as I showed last time, whereas Saul deeply distrusts David for bad reasons, David really does not have plans to harm Saul, at least not out loud, and Achish, on the other hand, trusts David when he really shouldn't. And maybe both of those are like Nabal, and we'll see a link today in this chapter with the Nabal scene in chapter 25. So a lot of parallels going on as the authors try to complete the story by doing a lot of memories and comparisons of different characters. And as I was showing the introductory video, almost all the verses here echo things from earlier. I showed the chart that is posted at radicalbible.net, specifically on chapter 28, where almost every verse echoes something elsewhere from Samuel. I haven't done that for the other chapters, but we'll see some of the specifics as we go. So this is part of the larger chiasm. We were here in the purple part, and now we're jumping over the green part. And that's part of what the authors are doing, is this is structurally chiastic because the Saul story is placed in between the David story. Just like here, Saul amongst the prophets with Samuel is placed in between David's story. So that works chiastically. It also works to alternate Samuel and David's stories, but it means throwing off the chronology a little bit. So that's why we're jumping to chapter 29 now. And I'll also put up the key words for chapter 29. There are a couple of elements to pay attention to. One is eyes, and we'll see good in eyes along the way, and there's an initial play on that because the word that's put as fountain here, which is a very strange way to translate that, is really eye, like spring. The Hebrew word ayin was originally like a circle, like an eye, or like a well of water, like a spring. So that's the point there. But there are two other situations. The purple is the commanders of the Philistines, only in this passage, but 4 times in 2 verses, in case we don't notice it. But there's also the lords of the Philistines. And the lords, as we'll see, the word for lord, sarne, is apparently a Philistine word. We don't really know much about any Philistine language. There's not a lot of written records to highlight that, but it's not a Semitic word. So in contrast to the Hebrew word for lord, Adon or Adonai, that we'll see with my lord the king, or his lord here. So even though those aren't the same words, I've put them in the same color of red here to highlight that what's at issue is authority of who's the lord. Is it the lords of the Philistines commanding Achish what to do? Is the Philistines concerned that David, if he sides with the Philistines, will not be able to reconcile himself with his lord, whether they mean Saul or whether they mean Yahweh there? Then we'll see the eyes of the lords in Achish's mouth, of the Philistine lords, and then hear about the question of my lord the king, which in this case is Achish. But down here, rise early in the morning, you and the servants of your lord, which is to say, in that case, is that Saul. So there's a real question of kings and lords and power here. And one of the things Achish is going to have to grapple with is, does he listen to the lords of the Philistines, who've traditionally been understood as a ruling council, or the commanders of the Philistines, who are the military generals? And isn't that a common question of whether you listen to what the politicians say or what the generals say? So both are on the scene here as we enter into our chapter. So we'll leave this up here as we begin to look at it. So now the Philistines, and now isn't really there in the Hebrew. That's a narrative link there so the readers can follow that this is a new scene following from the end of the scene with Saul and the witch in Endor. But really it's continuing from chapter 27. So the Philistines gathered all their forces. Machana here, we've heard that, we'll hear that. We heard it earlier in chapter 28, but we haven't looked at that yet. In the very beginning of 28 has a little hinge there, and we see it here, and 22 times in 1 Samuel. So the gathered collective forces at Aphek, and we saw where that was. But what's key here is it's recalling 4:1. Let's go back to that so we can see. So the word of Samuel came to all Israel. In those days, the Philistines mustered for war against Israel. Israel went out to battle against them, and they encamped at Ebenezer, and the Philistines encamped at Aphek. And that leads to a battle in which the Ark of the Covenant is taken, and Eli is whole reign is gone, and so it's a very negative scene for Israel, but it recalls that scene where the Philistines attack at Aphek and get the ark. So readers who've been paying attention to that ought to be a little nervous about this. While the Israelites were encamped at the fountain or the spring or the eye at Jezreel, and again, not that far. So they're up here in Jezreel, and the Philistines are in Aphek. So they're not arrayed for battle yet, but we'll see that the Philistines will go up there and the battle will take place over here. So, as the lords of the Philistines, and here we hear this word, the root sarin, here as sarne is plural. As Samora notes below, the term is probably Philistine, therefore non-Semitic in origin. And we've saw it in Judges a couple of times. We haven't in this series, but it's in Judges earlier. But it's a couple of times earlier here, and this is around the issue of the ark. Let's go back and look at that. And so here are the lords of the Philistines, and the 5 gold tumors and 5 gold mice corresponding to the lords of the Philistines there. So a little joke about the Philistines and the ark in that situation. And now we see them here. So they're not mentioned outside the Deuteronomistic history, and only once in 1 Chronicles. But they'll contrast with the commanders who we'll see here. So the lords of the Philistines were passing by the hundreds and by the thousands, echoing Saul's troops in chapter 15. Let's look at that right there, the high point of Saul. Yet another reminder of the situation in Telem, as we saw last time, but plainly around the Amalekites there. So the Amalekite situation in chapter 15 is all over our last chapters here, and Samuel will bring it up in chapter 28, which is already past in terms of the text, but is in the future in terms of the events. So while this huge mass of Philistines is passing by, David and his men, 600 of them, are passing on in the rear with Achish. Isn't that interesting that the mercenaries, if you will, or the resident aliens, however you want to think of David and his men in relation to the Philistines, are the ones who are with the king, whereas the lords are in the front. And this really raises the question of what Achish's power is in relation to the lords of the Philistines, because otherwise we don't hear about kings of the Philistines. We hear about this ruling council, which may correspond to the 5 major cities that we have here, but we don't know that for sure. They're never designated that way. So now we hear from the commanders of the Philistines. And as my note below says, Achish must keep his lords and commanders happy, who can check his authority. And there's 2 important echoes that we need to hear. One from 18:7 and 8 here, where we heard about Saul killing his thousands and David his tens of thousands. And we'll see that again in our scene as we already saw it when they recall David, but also 21:11 here, when the servants of Achish, not the commanders of the lords, but the servants of Achish said, "Is this not David, the king of the land? Did they not sing to one another in dances? Saul has killed his thousands and David his tens of thousands," which is what led David to be afraid and then play the madman and get booted out. So that song is not far from the ears of people. It must have been quite the hit song. So the commanders of the Philistines, Sare here is opposed to Sarni, used 4 times in here, and they say, what are these Hebrews doing here? And that leads us to look back at the Hebrews in 1 Samuel. As I've noted before, Hebrews is a pejorative term, although it is used by Saul once or twice. It's perhaps in a similar vein to the way African Americans use the N-word amongst themselves, but it's a very strong insult if used by outsiders. So it's very similar here, that Hebrew is a pejorative word, literally meaning crossers over, as if they're like wetbacks to Mexicans, people who came either illegally or clandestinely into somebody else's land. And that's exactly what the question is here. Let's take a pause for a moment and look at Hebrews in 1 Samuel and note what's going on. It's almost always in connection with the Philistines. So we saw also in chapter 4, notice that we just saw chapter 4:1 around Aphek. When the Philistines heard the noise of the shouting, they said, "What does this great shouting in the camp of the Hebrews mean?" And then they amongst themselves, a few verses later, say, "Take courage and be men, O Philistines, in order not to become slaves to the Hebrews, as they have been to you." Then a number of chapters later, we hear Jonathan defeated the garrison of the Philistines that was at Geba, and the Philistines heard it, and Saul blew the trumpet and said, "Let the Hebrews hear." So he's using that term negatively to try to get them to get going. Later in the chapter, the narrator tells us, quotes the Philistines, saying the Hebrews must not make swords or spears for themselves, so they have to fight. They can't use those kinds of weapons. And then the next chapter, we hear Jonathan and his boys showed themselves, and this is in the Battle of Michmash, to the garrison of the Philistines, and the Philistines said, "Look, Hebrews coming out of the holes." And a little later, 10 verses later, the Hebrews had previously been with the Philistines and gone up with them into the camp, turned and joined the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. Let's note what's happening there. They're noting that in the battle, some of the Israelites, being called Hebrews here, had turned and joined the Philistines, much like David has done here. But David doesn't do it because he's in the middle of battle. David does it allegedly because he's trying to protect himself from Saul, or maybe he's just trying to wait it out there. We'll see more about how we go. And then we get to our situation here. So Hebrews throughout this situation is how the Philistines have seen them, and negatively, and that's what we hear here from the commanders of the Philistines, the military folks. What are they doing here? And Achish responds to them, "Is this not David?" Echoing what we just heard otherwise. Is this not David? But he says, "Is not David the servant of King Saul of Israel?" As Bodner notes laconically below, may not be the wisest appellation under the circumstances. But notice what I was just contrasting in 21:11, where the servants of Achish, his own people, called David the king of the land. Diana Edelman thinks that this links him to Nabal, as we see here in 25:10 and 11, where Nabal said, "Who is David? Who is the son of Jesse?" There are many servants today who are breaking away from their masters, and that's exactly what it sounds like here. The Philistines are saying David was a servant of King Saul who's now broken away from his master, although this is Achish saying that. The commanders don't trust it, but Achish seems to, who has been with thee now for days and years. And notice the narrator told us the entire time that he's there is 16 months. So Achish is exaggerating here to suggest that David has been around a lot longer. In other words, he's making a good case for David over against the evidence. "Since he deserted to me," using the word nephalo here, which Robert Alter suggests can be translated, "since he fell in with me, I have found no fault in him to this day." Isn't Achish the positive reader of David as on the side of the Philistines? But the commanders of the Philistines are not going for this here at all. As my long note below, and let's look at it here, the narrator provides many indications that the Philistines' commander evaluation is correct, whereas Achish is naive based on the false information he's been fed by David. And here's some of the evidence. I won't read the whole thing, but we can hear. One is the utilitarian aspect. The implication of the David story is that he is grooming himself to be king of Israel after Saul's death. Another is, we've seen David's behavior in the past, recalling chapter 21, and then how David and his men react when they hear the bitter tidings of Israel's defeat and the deaths of Saul and Jonathan coming up ahead of us. When David and his men learn of the outcome of the battle at Mount Gilboa, they rend their garments, lament, weep, and fast until the evening, mourning the deaths of Saul, Jonathan, and the house of Israel. This is not the reaction of persons who only shortly earlier had intended to fight against Israel on the side of the Philistines. And then also David's ambiguous language that we've just been looking at. And finally, the reference to the battle in the Elah Valley, in which David played a decisive role in the victory over the Philistines. I guess that wasn't the last one. There's still a couple more. Achish's characterization as a naive, if not indeed foolish monarch, which we've been looking at, and the realistic presentation of the Philistine commander's evaluation. This all from the author Shemesh an article on this exact point. So I know I kind of roughly went over that, but it's a whole article that I'm trying to summarize in a few points there. And if Shemesh can see all those things, and yet Achish sees none of it. So no wonder the Philistines' commanders are angry, using the word only here in Samuel, but it's often used for Yahweh's anger. So you notice how Abram trusted Yahweh, and we saw the parallel with Achish trusting David. Here the Philistines are angry, parallel to Yahweh's anger. And the with him is ambiguous. It's not clear if they're angry at David or they're angry at Achish. But the commanders said to Achish, and notice it's repeated over and over again, 4 times in these 2 verses, send the man back, notice they won't say his name, so that he may return to the place that you have assigned to him, which would be Ziklag there. Only here in Samuel in the Hiphil here, but it's also in 1 Kings with great portent for Solomon appointing Jeroboam over slave labor. Jeroboam, who eventually led the rebellion against Solomon's son Rehoboam, but that's farther down the road. He shall not go down with us to battle. In verse 9, that'll be reversed, will not go up to us in battle, or else he may become an adversary. And the word for adversary here is Satan, which is plainly a Persian loanword. There's no argument about that, that before exposure to the Persian culture, the Hebrew Bible would not know the word Satan. So this is one of those examples where this, at least this section, if not a whole chunk of 1 Samuel, if not all of 1 Samuel, might be understood as post-exilic from the Persian period, an argument that scholars like Mark Brett, as I've been noting earlier, have made much about in many articles as well as books. So, may become an adversary, not Satan in the later Christian sense as a metaphysical figure, but simply as an adversary, as it described here, or an accuser. That's literally what it meant in the Persian context, as a spy sent in under cover to see what's going on and to report back to the king, to accuse them of being subversive or unfaithful. And that's exactly what's at issue here, is that they think that David will become someone on the other side, as he has been all along. Now they use a more insulting word for how could this fellow, using the Hebrew zak and contemptuous label, reconcile himself here. Again, a word only used here in the Hitbatel, literally make himself acceptable to his Lord. And whether that's Saul or Yahweh isn't clear. It's not clear that they would be saying Yahweh. Would it not be with the heads of the men here? As Bodner notes, a bit of humor here, just as he secured his master's daughter by means of their foreskins. And it's echoing something we haven't looked at, but readers reading in sequence would, was that in the transition from 27 to 28, we heard that David had said to Achish, well, very well, then you know what your servant can do. And Achish said to David, I will make you bodyguard for life, but literally it means I will appoint you as the keeper of my head forever. And then it shifts into the situation of Saul being afraid and seeking out some support from the dead Samuel. So a play on words there who are following along. But they continue bringing up the refrain, is this not David of whom they sing to one another in dances? Saul has killed his thousands and David his tens of thousands. So all the issue of thousands and commanders here also recall that in chapter 8, when the first issue came up, the word from Yahweh via Samuel was that the king would take your sons and make them commanders of his hundreds and of his thousands. The Philistines are certainly doing that. David hasn't become king officially yet, and he has not made commanders of thousands. He's only got 600. But the Philistines do have thousands, and David's killed thousands of them, and the commanders do not want David around. So in our next video, we'll see how Achish responds to his generals and his political council wanting David out of there. See you for that next time. Bye-bye.